Well, good morning. It's so nice to be able to gather together again, isn't it? I know, it's so nice. My name's Cindy Person, and on behalf of Keep It Green, I want to welcome you to the first in a multi-part educational series called Discover the Neck. Now, the purpose of this series is to offer members of our community more information about our land, our environment, and our history. And for me, not only is it very interesting to know more about the place where we live, but it also helps us to understand and to appreciate the importance of being the very best stewards we can be of this unique place called the Waccamaw Neck. And this is really the foundation of the work that Keep It Green and other similar local organizations are doing here in our community. So we want to thank you for being here to be part of that. Right now, I'd like to recognize the committee that put this program together. When I call your name, just raise your hand to be recognized. So Dwayne Draper and Mary Beth Klein were the co-chairs of this committee. They're both board members. Heather Kinder, who couldn't be here today, Beverly Sullivan, Peg Howell, Joanna Jones, Amy Jones, Nancy Rogers. Thank you very much. And to all the others who jumped in at the last minute to help us out, we appreciate it. A couple housekeeping matters. If you are not on our mailing list, on the Keep It Green mailing list, there's a table in the back where Beverly and Marla are seated, and you may provide your email address, and we'd be very, very happy to have you added to our list. Also, at the middle table, there are surveys asking, because this is just the first in what we're hoping is a multi-part series. It's a survey asking what subject matters you would like to learn more about. So if you fill one of those out before you leave, that would be wonderful. So it's an honor and a privilege this morning to have Lee Brockington here with us to kick off this event. And after her presentation, we will have a question and answer session that Dwayne will facilitate. And we appreciate if you would hold your questions until then. And so Dwayne Draper will come forward now and introduce our speaker this morning. Thank you.
So Lee Brockington really doesn't need an introduction to most of you folks, but there's some really good stuff in here, so I'm going to do an introduction anyway. We are really pleased to have Lee here to do the kickoff event for the Discover the Neck series. Lee is a South Carolina history consultant with an interest in connections and common threads between the past and the present. Now retired staff of the Belle W. Baruch Foundation at Housekeeping Matters after 30 years. Wow. Lee was formerly a curator of education at the Historic Columbia Foundation in Columbia, South Carolina, active member of the South Carolina Federation of Museums, Southeastern Museum Conference, American Alliance of Museums, South Carolina Education Television, board member of several organizations, including Winya Rivers Foundation, League of Women Voters, Georgetown County, Miss Ruby's Kids, and Friends of the Waccamaw Library. Lee's interests include history, the environment, and education, and her career and volunteer work reflect her desire to continue to learn and then share that information with others, such as yourselves. Her community courses are offered through Coastal Carolina University's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute program, Linda Ketron's class organization, and her field studies for elementary schools have brought her satisfaction and personal growth as she learns and shares. Rather than an expert in history, Lee prefers to be described as a student of history. And I'm a student of Lee Brockington. Everything I know as a docent at Housekeeping Matters, I learned from Lee. And just one aside, if you're wondering how we got 3 inches of rain in the last 36 to 48 hours, we did a rain dance a couple days ago at the Blue Whale Farm, so we have Lee to thank for that as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Lee Gordon Brockington.
It feels awfully good to be here at the library. Y'all know I love my library, like so many people. And also it feels good to be out in public after COVID and so many other things in my life. It especially makes me feel good to see so many familiar faces, new friends, and especially old friends, even church friends. God led you here today. God's mandate that you would come. I do appreciate getting to come today. Anything Dwayne asks, I usually say yes. I haven't done much again for about 1.5 years, but Dwayne came over to my yard and helped me rake and burn leaves for hours and hours and hours. And right as he was finishing, he said, Lee, I need you to do me a favor. How could I say no? So let's think today about the changing face of our island. As the sun set over the Waccamaw River and beyond it, the Petey, the Black, and the Sandpit Rivers, Plowman Weston headed south on River Road to his home at Hagley Plantation. His wife Emily greeted him at the door, and they retired to his study overlooking the rice fields and tidal waters of the Waccamaw. On this night, Weston was fully reflective. From his chair, he perused his vast library and felt pride in his collection, supplying him with knowledge he so eagerly sought. Several of the old documents he had collected revealed early glimpses of the Carolina coast, and among his papers were those of John Lawson, who in 1700 noted the flora and fauna of the regions around this tidal coast. Recorded as A New Voyage to Carolina, and still in print in 2021, John Lawson was led by an Indian guide throughout the territory, recently claimed by the English in 1670. Within decades of that date, land grants were sought and given to men like John Alston and Percival Pauley, who were 2 of the first men to acquire land on the Waccamaw Neck by 1715. Lawson revealed he met the Seawee tribe between Charlestown and the Santee River, and that they very early had been in trade with the British. Hoping to cut out the middleman, the Seawee tribe's men loaded their dugout canoes with furs and skins. Their well-made cypress dugout canoes, however, could not survive the ocean voyage due to what was then called a sudden storm. Dr. Carrie Mock of the University of South Carolina has now researched that 1700 storm and believes it was a true hurricane off our coast. We do know that the surviving Indians who were rescued from that venture were sold into slavery, and that was one of South Carolina's first industries. More Native Americans were sold from South Carolina than any other mainland English colony, and for the express purpose of being shipped to the English colonies in the Caribbean. The Native Americans did not live, much less thrive, as enslaved laborers, and the trade was supplanted by timber, native timber harvested from pine and oak forest, from cypress and tupelo swamps. The need for naval stores, building supplies for the British Navy, was great. Think of the beams and boards, the virgin timber, pitch and tar used as marine sealant. The large clearings where timber had stood became clearings for agriculture and for settlement. And by the 1730s, Georgetown, the 3rd oldest town in South Carolina, Charleston, Beaufort, and Georgetown, became the port of entry. Georgetown, a port of entry. Export records available in a publication by Ron Bridwell, To Put There a Port by Ron Bridwell, details those early exports. In addition to timber, beef, we know that cattle grazed freely under the once endless longleaf pine forest, those open savannas. Also, in addition to beef, pork. Pigs had first been brought by the Spanish to the area and proved to be easy keepers, foraging for everything in the lowlands and the uplands. breeding and reproducing easily. Today's feral hogs have proved exactly how easily these pigs have lived in the wild. As word spread between the 1730s and the 1770s, agriculture in Georgetown district grew, and indigo was grown on the high ground. Rice was grown in the wetlands. Indigo is a shrub, about 5 feet tall, or really about 4'10". And it was planted in upland fields and then harvested, and then the entire plant chopped and soaked and processed for its blue dye, as most of you know. Rice was grown in the wetland areas, but the first rice was actually grown in inland swamps. But when those swamps needed to be wet, they were dry, and when those inland swamps were dry, they needed to be wet. Due to research by Suzanne Linda Hurley for her large rice atlas, we know that tidal rice, utilizing the cleared swamps adjacent to the tidal rivers, was begun well before the Revolutionary War. By 1750, Hurley also found that real estate sale descriptions for tidal rice fields along the river. And with that innovation, also as you know, based on observations of West African agriculture in those tidal areas, the slave trade grew exponentially during that pre-revolutionary era. Small rice planters with few enslaved laborers were pushed out, and large rice planters purchased properties, investing their profits in more land and in more slaves. Experiments with crops was typical. Rice was immediately successful, but also so was cotton in inland areas, corn, oats, all grown with enough to sell in addition to keeping what was needed for livestock. Indigo's story is worth an entire lecture and a workshop. Even Amy King is offering an indigo workshop as part of her summer program this year. This area's first wealth, the Georgetown district's first wealth, was due to indigo, not rice. As a British colony, South Carolina grew for the British trade, and imagine the need for royal blue. Imagine the need for navy blue, blue, the most color-fast of all dyes. And although Georgetown district produced a great deal of indigo, as did other districts in and around Charleston and Beaufort, it was the Williamsburg district, inland, that had the most highly prized indigo. Today it's county seat King Street, and also on the Black River, Mingo Creek, a trade center known then as Willtown, figured prominently in the indigo trade. My Brockington ancestors, as I was discussing with somebody, were on Black Mingo and involved in indigo, but they were also loyalists. I'm not sure why DAR hasn't asked me to join, but that may be the reason. And I'm teasing, they have asked me to join, but be on the other side. Trade continued between our indigo planters and the British until about midway through the Revolutionary War, when trade was finally cut off and Britain returned to dealing with the French West Indies, whose indigo was always of superior quality. Rice continued after reestablishing agriculture following the destruction of the Revolutionary War. Most people know of the fires and the destruction of the Civil War, but the Low Country and the Up Countries, woods, fields, and farms, were destroyed by the British. Everything I believe that Sherman learned, he learned from Tarleton, the British general. Some of you may remember at Brook Green when they offered the very first cool summer evenings. Now, that's not an oxymoron. In Low Country, Bill Oberst portrayed the British Colonel Tarleton. Bill Oberst, who's been here at the library so many times, and it was my great honor to portray the widow Richardson, who had been burned out by Tarleton, later teaching Sherman everything he knew. Rice was first grown in Virginia. Many of y'all have read legends and stories and some of the early versions of how rice came to South Carolina, but keep in mind it was first planted in and around Jamestown, Virginia, then it trickled down to North Carolina and was experimented with. However, tobacco did so much better in Virginia. tobacco did so much better in North Carolina, and they maintained a grip on that trade market. And so South Carolina continued to look for something different. We didn't get into the tobacco business until the turn of the 20th century, but made a lot of money at that time. Rice was grown in other areas, but once Georgetown County began to plant rice and invest in more and more enslaved labor, it became known that Georgetown County grew more rice than any other place in the world except the area around Calcutta, India. Why then, when you go to Charleston, you hear the docents say, Charleston exported more rice than any other place in the world except Calcutta, India. And I had a grown student with the now defunct Ollie program look at that docent and say, Lee said, and I'm like, And what's the difference? Georgetown County was growing that rice. We were exporting it from the farms on individual schooners. It was going to Charleston as the larger port by 1850, Georgetown being excluded from that trade. And Charleston was exporting rice from so many different areas. But remember, Georgetown grew more rice than any other place in the world except the area around the port of Calcutta. The culture of predominantly West African people kidnapped and held in bondage is a story of survival, physical survival, emotional and psychological survival. And as historians continue to research, the music, the food, the art, baskets, and language survived. The Gullah culture, and the more geographically inclusive Gullah Geechee culture, reflects the people whose ancestors worked as enslaved laborers on rice plantations from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. The Ogeechee River dividing Georgia and Florida, the Gullah Geechee people. The origin of the term Gullah is still not known. Some people want to attach it to Angola, but most researchers have not found exactly where the term comes from. But just remember how it's pronounced, Gullah. Gula is akin to goulash. And people are trying so hard to pronounce things correctly, and the only reason I correct people's mispronunciations so that nobody will know that you're not from here. Because you are from here now, aren't you? Yes. For decades and even a century, the arguments about legal slavery in America festered. The highest concentration of slaves existed in agricultural areas, but slaves existed in nearly all pre-revolutionary colonies, and as states outlawed slavery, states continued, however, to buy slave-produced goods, especially South Carolina cotton for New England textile mills. The legacy of slavery remains an economic boom before the Civil War and as a curse all of America deals with today. In Georgetown County, economically, the district went from being one of the richest areas in the nation to one of the poorest areas in the nation. After the Civil War, rice was produced, but in an ever-declining market. Consortiums or conglomerates, businesses like Lashcott and Sons, pooled resources, bought up rice plantations, and produced a fair amount of rice, particularly in the 1880s and the 1890s, until, for three major reasons, and for a number of minor reasons, the decline of rice began. The cost of labor no longer was free labor was available or being utilized, so the cost of labor. Number two, competition from western states. You've heard this often. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas began to plant rice. They were using new and modern methods and heavy machinery. And although some modern experimentation was going on in this area, according to research, we know some were trying, but it was very expensive to invest in new methods, particularly with the laborers in place, even though they were now being paid or traded out as residence and food, a roof over their head. Number three, and finally, a series of hurricanes, droughts, and storms. Hurricanes, droughts, and freshets, floods, not unlike the flood of 15, not unlike the threat of Hurricane Florence in our area. Well, not just the threat, but the flood. Between 1893 and 1911, almost annually, The last crop of rice grown, milled, and sold was 1910. I love it because for years and years I say the last crop of rice was milled in 1911. And one of our docents, Alec Tootin, said, I said, what? 1911 was the year of the big storm. And he goes, yes, but the last crop of rice milled was 1910 because the hurricane destroyed the crop in 1911. It's not semantics, it's accuracy. That's why I'm a student of history. You can always be corrected. You can always learn. Waverly Plantation had become Waverly Mills after the Civil War. Midway on the Waccamaw Neck, it had been in rice production for centuries. Alston descendants had sold, and the Lashcotts diversified by the 1880s into various mills, from rice mills to lumber mills to a barrel factory to a nail factory, a boat landing at Waverly Landing, and the mailing address until 1939 was Waverly Mills, South Carolina. Because all the action was on the river. Transportation, travel, the mail boat stopped at Waverly Mills, South Carolina. And we'll mention why it changed in 1939 shortly. Even a marine railway, I had to look that up. For a long time I couldn't figure out what a marine railway was. Think about dry dock, but not just storage, but repair. So think of the work and the activity and the employment that went on at Waverly Mills, due east of Pawleys Island on the Waccamaw River. By the 1920s, Waccamaw Neck plantations were also being converted to truck farms. Waverly, Litchfield, Willbrook, Turkey Hill, better known today as the Reserve, where some of you may live, all the way up to Waccamaw. Southern owners were growing staples for northern markets, and also southern owners and individuals from this area were exporting wild game in large numbers at the turn of the 20th century. Ducks and deer and turkey and even terrapin. Not all terrapin come from Maryland. Our diamondback terrapins and a number of other turtles like snapping turtles put terrapin and fine dining on the same menu at fine hotels in Washington and New York. South Carolina plantation duck and terrapin soup. And thinking of the North, Bernard Baruch was the very first Northerner to purchase property in this area for the express purpose of a family-owned private hunting retreat. 1905, he was the first. Isaac Emerson purchased what he renamed Arcadia in 1906, and then later gave that property to his grandson, George Vanderbilt. Between 1905 and 1930, the Huntingtons made one of the last purchases of these former plantations. And you'll hear me say it over and over. I consider the purchase by Northerners as a blessing in disguise. Were these new Northern owners as interested in agriculture? No. In timber harvesting? No. In altering the geographic landscape? No. We can talk about the hundreds of ducks per day that were killed. We can talk about the decline in wildlife, but a blessing in disguise, because in addition to some farming, like cattle, hogs, turkey, gentleman farming, we might call it, some of these new owners were keeping employees, white and black, busy. The economics of Northern ownership in the 1905 to the 1930s. Many of you know that the Huntingtons kept creating jobs. Let's build a wall here. Teaching people how to lay brick. Creating work for people who were unemployed. There is no doubt of the economic and environmental impacts that the purchases of these plantations by Northerners made. Hiring staff, paying taxes, making purchases from cars to tractors to the need for a railroad spur from Lane, South Carolina, which was part of that north-south transit, Lane, South Carolina, into Georgetown. Before Northerners began utilizing so much of the train transportation, before truck farming, there had not been a need for a rail line into Georgetown. Also during this era, we began to see improved docks on the waterfront at Georgetown, better highways, and better bridges. Dare I say that some of those bridges that were built in the 20s and 30s are those bridges that we're just now replacing. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? As America turned to personal transportation, the automobile, and away from railroads and traveling on the Clyde line, automobile sales skyrocketed, and the U.S. developed an improved highway system. U.S. Highway 17 was created from the old State Route 45, but before it was called 45, it was better known as the King's Highway. With just a few exceptions, the King's Highway that had once connected Boston, New York, and Charleston was straightened. They avoided some swamps, came inland, went outward. And think about that seasonal travel between New York and Miami that many of us remember during our time. And imagine the need then to meet the needs of the auto travelers, needing then, as now, fill-in stations, diners, restaurants, motor courts, which became the motel. I still say motel, and I have to stop myself because there are not many motels left, are there? Everything's a hotel, yeah. Unless you're at Super 8. Motel 6. I don't think they've changed their name. Maybe it's Inn. Is it Super 8 Inn now? But think also of how difficult it was for the Negro traveler as the Green Book appealed to those filling stations and those particular restaurants or diners that were available. But along major roads, and especially the U.S. highway, the need for travelers, the needs were being met. During the 1930s, speaking of transportation, an airport in Georgetown, although private, had been established, and by World War II, the current county-owned airport was established and, of course, continues today. Myrtle Beach had created its first airport in the 1930s by the former Mayor Harrelson, but the military bought it for training, and as many of us continue to call it for years and years, the air base existed until it was decommissioned in the 1990s. A lot of us gave directions according to just beyond the back gate and right before the back gate. And I'll never forget, somebody said, the back gate or what? I said, the air base. They're like, what air base? I said, you know. And they didn't know. Of course they didn't, because they moved here about 2000. And I needed to learn to say Market Common. And there's no S on Market Common, is that correct? And there's no S on Walmart. I just learned that. So, back to the 30s. Think about airports. Think about that being really our only major transportation beyond those highways. Georgetown County suffers mightily during the Great Depression, as you would expect. The railroad spur is disconnected. Shipping declines temporarily, but it is the paper mill in many ways that saves our county. Economically, the largest employer for decades. Construction began in 1936 during that Great Depression. International Paper Company bought lands not only for the mill itself, adjacent to the Sandpit River, but International Paper, a paper company, needs two things. They need woods and they need water. And so it was that they purchased acreages, a number of former plantations that had been overhunted but still had timber, a number of plantations that they could utilize for resources for the mill. Those mill-created products became in demand. By World War II, IP was creating all of the boxes that the military was transporting food and other supplies overseas. The box plant, as many people say, where they had their first job or their career at the box plant. By the time I came in the 80s, we were talking about chicken boxes, waxed cardboard boxes that sometimes you could purchase cheaply for storage. And then I understand people buy lawyer boxes now, lawyer boxes. Employment continued to rise after World War II at International Paper and its various operations, and on the IP land, tree farms, where timber was harvested, and by the 1950s, timber was replanted with new forestry practices in place. A post-World War II population boom created the need for neighborhoods and improved schools, mostly in Georgetown and Andrews, with a very rural population still living at Pawleys Island and in Murrells Inlet. Small community schools and a few large churches, black and white, were the community centers of the pre- and post-World War II era. Highway 17 became busier in the 1940s and 50s. We know that in 1938 the Lashcotts diversified again, and one branch established the hammock shop in 1938. And I thought it was interesting that it was Captain Doc Lashcott who had the idea of a nursery, and his wife Virginia said, well, we ought to sell a few items for the tourists. And within a year or so, gifts and souvenirs and nursery were written on the sign. Miss Virginia had an incredible sense of what would be appealing for visitors, for travelers going up and down I-17, Highway 17. Lashcott's store moved to the highway from Waverly Mills. By 1939, the post office was inside that store, and the postmark was changed to Hawley's Island in 1939. Next door to Lashcott's store, Mr. Harry Marlowe operated a grocery store, previously managing small grocery stores closer to the river, closer to the four-way stop where Waverly and Kings River Road, as we call it today. Harry Marlowe's son, Frank, took over the store when Frank returned from World War II. Frank and Faye Marlowe. Faye Marlowe, I used to ask her a history question. She goes, well, I don't really know because I didn't move here until 1949. And I remember thinking, Miss Marlowe, you're going to be a good reference for me. She goes, but I don't know, you need to ask Alberta, Doc's sister, Alberta Lashcott Quattlebaum, who many of you know, and we'll mention her shortly. So those stores provided more than just groceries, not more than just gas, more than caviar even, as Frank Marlowe provided, also provided a telephone and all sorts of communication, whether it was messages or whether it was gossip. Both stores became very important community centers. In 1950, Georgetown County finally built a hospital. Previously, people had to go either to Florence or Charleston, and believe it or not, Mcleod Infirmary in Florence was closer because of geography. Stop and think about it. Before there were reasonable bridges, before there were reasonable ferries leaving Georgetown and crossing the Sandpit, the North Santee, the South Santee, the Wando, Allendale Creek, much less the Cooper River, was an ordeal in rainy weather. But going inland to Florence was not quite as treacherous. Mcleod Hospital and the Mcleod system now is so large that if you ever go to the hospital in Florence, go down to the ER wing and read the historic timeline mural on the wall. It's where I like to spend my time when I'm at a hospital. I like to go down reading the history instead of the charts. Think about that, 1950, no hospital until 1950. But another change was in store, this time catastrophic and economically devastating. In October 1954, Hurricane Hazel hits. It affects not just the beach, not just the Waccamaw Neck, but the entire county. One of the things that I thought was so interesting, Hazel in '54 and Hugo in 1989, Brook Green Gardens was hit very hard both times. And the director then, during Hazel, and again in 1989, was Mr. Gurdon Tarbox. Wow. Mr. Tarbox was asked, perhaps by the editor of the Coastal Observer, which was worse, Hugo or Hazel? And of course, that was a major question for a lot of people that had experienced Hugo, but had only heard about Hazel. Well, Gurdon knew the difference. He worked both, but he got real quiet and he said, which was worse? Well, I'll tell you this. After Hugo, we had chainsaws. Think about how difficult it was when trees were uprooted, when trees fell. Think about the recovery process then compared to 1989. I thought his answer was very telling. Recovery was quick for international paper and the tourist trade, harder and slower for others. The hurricane began to mark the time before Hazel and after Hazel. In 1969, another big change, but most county residents saw this change as a huge positive. On Front Street, right on Front Street, and not far from International Paper's downtown plant, the steel mill begins construction. 1969, providing employment for a great number of people, especially black and white, who, according to tradition, were promoted according to their abilities and not kept in specific departments because of their race. The 1960s, University of South Carolina, I said I wasn't going to have any asides because we were going to keep it short. Sorry, I have an aside. University of South Carolina was doing an oral history project, and they had an opportunity to interview a number of people connected with the steel mill, which was still open at that time doing the project. And the University of South Carolina student brought a number of the interviews and information, and we discussed them at the Kimball Lodge at Housekeeping Matters during that workshop. And one of the things that stuck with me for so long was, if the steel mill wasn't on Front Street, if it was way out in the country, we'd never have to see it. We'd never know about it. And the other students were like, yeah, that'd be good, wouldn't it? But you know what that means. We wouldn't have to think about it. We wouldn't have to think about industry. We wouldn't have to think about quality of life. We wouldn't have to think about what it meant when the steel mill closed more recently and those people began commuting. Men and women, but often the heads of households commuting and being gone for a week, perhaps returning on the weekend, perhaps not having a car that they could easily commute in even on the weekends. Family structure changed. Think about industry as important as tourism and other sources of revenue. The 1960s and 1970s saw exponential beach traffic as well. Murrells Inlet pleasure fishing, the idea of all-you-can-eat oyster roast and seafood restaurants, motels up and down the Grand Strand, and at Pawleys Island, rental houses. Pawleys Island shifted from family-owned and family-used beach houses to more and more seasonal rentals. The 1935 pavilion had burned, but replaced in 1960 by another pavilion, the more familiar pavilion of your memory, perhaps. It burned too. It's kind of a pattern, isn't it? Places with loud music burn. Keep it low. I'm just telling you, keep it low. The summer season was the season. Even when I moved to Pawleys Island in 1984, restaurants closed. To supplement my income at Housekeeping Matters in 1984, I worked at the Anchor Inn restaurant in Murrells Inlet. I wasn't good enough to be a waitress, so I was a waitress helper. I worked in the kitchen. What a blessing that I got to know whites and blacks who were native of Murrells Inlet. What an opportunity to work there, but then come November, shut down. And we didn't reopen until March or even Easter at that time. Wow. The thing that I liked the most about the winter season was that nobody came and rented those drafty old pine cottages on Pawleys Island. I could ride my bike at noon on a Saturday up Highway 17 in the median to go to the post office. And guess what I had in my bike basket? My orphan raccoon. It was a different time, even as late as 1984. A sense of community among the year-round residents existed, but when the summer season started, renewed friendships were heralded, and these independent businesses that we've mentioned, restaurants, motels, stores, heralded rather than resented the summer influx of visitors. Traffic, each person in a car was a potential customer. What changed us to a year-round community so fast in the late 20th century? What else? Another natural occurrence. In 1989, of course, Hurricane Hugo. I could give a whole separate lecture on Hugo, maybe I have. I lived through it. It was a tough time for me. I lived in a $150 rental, $150 a month, woo! Rental on the beach, and I was flooded out. I served on town council before and after Hurricane Hugo. I'd just gotten engaged, and I was engaged to the Santee Cooper man. It was a little stressful. But you know, when you're going through it, you don't know you're going through it. You just put one foot in front of the other, and you keep going. And so, growth after Hugo coincided with what I think is interesting, with a slate of World War II and Korea retirees, retirement packages in the 90s and the 2000s that gave the incentives for a second home or for a new start in the South, on the Grand Strand, and on the Waccamaw Neck. 1990 was the year that our new Waccamaw Library opened because there were enough people that needed a library. How did we know the population statistics? Because Hardee's had done their homework. Hardee's opened about that time. And you know, that fast food, they put a lot of money in market numbers. Are there enough people to support a Hardee's? Then there are enough people to support a library. So we did it. We did it. The sudden changes, the immediate needs for infrastructure, and the rising property taxes on the Waccamaw Neck were overwhelming to many. At a meeting when Alberta Lashcott Quattlebaum was present, I'll never forget her comment. Somebody said, you know, the Waccamaw Neck now is carrying the whole county. 90% of the budget is coming from us on the Waccamaw Neck. And she spoke up and she said, it's only fair for the rest of the century, Georgetown County carried us. And that's because of that agriculture, that isolation that we talked about. Remember that, because I thought that was real telling and it's always stayed with me. The county's largest employer, again for so long International Paper, was supplanted in the 1990s by Georgetown County School District. The school district, due to so many families, especially in the service industries or following their parents to the area, needed elementary, middle, and high schools. And then by at least 2010, the county's largest employer today, here's a hint, I have gray hair now, and some of you do too. The county's largest employer is the hospital, absolutely. The Georgetown County Hospital System, Tidelands Hospital, is our county's largest employer. Why? Our aging population. Hospitals, too. The Ford Cancer Treatment Center, rehab centers, diagnostic centers, even a fitness center, so we won't get sick and have to go to the hospital. So much change. And when people say to me, we need to keep Pawleys as it was, I just have to ask, what decade? The 1930s, during the Great Depression, the 1960s, before civil rights legislation, when you could still get a maid real cheap, 70s, during the gas crisis, summers when people hardly came and rented at all, the 80s, when Hurricane Hugo hit. Pick a decade. And so, change is inevitable. And change can be good, or it can be very bad. And how can change be good? Obviously, with involvement from community members, strong leadership with an idea and a willingness to plan for the future, and an awareness of the past to guide us in the cultural, economic, and environmental progress. Progress is exactly what it always should be. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
So we've got a little bit of time for Q&A.
Can you hear him? Get a little closer. Can you hear him?
A little bit of time for Q&A if you've got any questions of Lee's presentation. But I think it's really interesting how she's provided the perspective of the land that we live in, the community that we live in, to see how it's changed. I mean, it's good to know history and to realize the perspective of what we're facing moving forward, whether it's a tree ordinance or comprehensive plan, land use planning. There's lots of challenges moving forward, as there is in any decade, right? But I thought Lee did a great job of giving us all a baseline for where we've been, where we've come, and to help us make informed decisions moving forward. And we'd love to have all of you involved as part of that discussion moving forward, as does the county, believe me. They do want input. And so we're going to have many more opportunities beyond today's session for educational, informational programs. Cindy mentioned the survey. There's a survey sheet in the back, and we're asking for ideas for topics that you'd like to hear about, that you're passionate about, or would like to participate in. So please fill out one of those survey forms before you leave. We're also going to be taking cards to put into the donation box, or people who have signed up, and have a couple of drawings to give out a couple of Keep It Green t-shirts. So, a prized item.
Because not everybody's wearing green today.
That's right. So any questions for Lee?
That was fascinating. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. Do we know the actual meaning of the terms Waccamaw and Winyah?
We do.
I didn't know who else to ask.
Good. In fact, I just answered an email a few months late from someone writing a book on Murrells Inlet. And I got to thinking it might be a novel for all I know, but he was asking about sources for Native American words. And the source that I've gone to for years and years and feel like I can trust is research done by Dr. Claude Neifer and his wife Irene Neifer. They created a series of books that are archived at the South Caroliniana Society, the Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina, Names in South Carolina. And when I came across their definition, I felt like it was easy to communicate and important to communicate. Waccamaw is believed by those researchers to mean coming and going. Think of the tidal river, coming and going. And also their research, and that's been published, also Winyah is believed to mean the bend. Places were named first, and then tribes took their name from those geographic places. So the Winyah tribe were the people who lived at the bend, and that bend would have been on the other side, near Belle Isle, near Maryville, below Georgetown. But the people of the bend, the Winyah tribe. So the bend your elbow, Winyah, and coming and going, Waccamaw. I trust those sources. Other researchers may eventually find out something different. Indian names are hard, but also sometimes Indian names are all we have left of that culture. Place names are. Good question. Thanks for letting me say that out loud, because all of y'all are going to remember. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. I just want to know, I had heard at one time there was a cannery at the end of Waverly. Is that true? And when was it?
Yes, the cannery was that same era, 1910, 1920, and the cannery was important. One of the, early, it's been said that one of the first canneries was at Waverly, connected to Waverly. Some of the first export of oysters, think about canned oysters, and were they in jars as opposed to cans? Yes, but we still call canning putting up in jars. But a lot of the harvesting was done at the boat landing at Huntington Beach State Park that we now call Oyster Landing. On maps from the 1930s that Clemson University retired librarian gave me, thought I might like to use them on the endnotes of a book I was doing, and then I had to tell him no, because the landing in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s started with the letter N. So many African Americans were employed by the Lashcotts, the brothers, at that canning factory, that the landing had a different name. You can guess, can't you? So Oyster Landing, as our state calls it today, is where a lot of those oysters were coming in. Did the canning occur there, or did they bring all the oysters back to Waverly? Probably so, and do the work at Waverly. What's interesting too is what happened to the shells. Now we know that they're recycled into the marsh, right? That's based on research. Isn't it interesting that the road that led from Waverly Mills out to what became Highway 17 for many, many years was known as Shell Road. Shell Road. But the canning of vegetables was secondary, because I think most of the fresh vegetables were going out with the truck farming, with the industry. But certainly that first canning factory that we hear about, it's hard to believe that it'd be the first when you think about Maryland and Virginia, but wouldn't it be nice if we could prove that we were first before Virginia? But oysters especially. Yes, good question. And remember that when you go to Oyster Landing in Huntington.
I'm going to show my age.
Good.
You're talking about truck farming and Mr. Trask out on Shell Road. I seem to remember that there were German prisoners working those fields when I was a baby.
And that is true. German,
Remember.
yeah.
Is that true?
The truck farm, and do you want to say what decade that was?
Yeah, early, it was the 40s. Yeah.
Okay, the 40s, and well, it had to be if we're talking about POWs, I'm sorry.
Right.
I knew that.
How long did they stay? Do you know?
Probably until the war ended at the latest. y'all may already know from good exhibits at the Horry County Museum, there was a very large prisoner of war camp at Myrtle Beach. Are y'all aware of that? Go see that exhibit at the Horry County Museum. They have part of it as a permanent exhibit. They've had special exhibits in the past, and some of our books by Susan McMillan have included information about the German prisoner of war camp. But German prisoners were sent to the Myrtle Beach area and were housed and put to work not only there but also loaned. The more work they could do, the better. That seems synonymous for many years with prisoners. But some of them did come to truck farms that had then been bought out by a large operation under the name Trask, T-R-A-S-K, so Trask Farms. And I remember Frank Marlowe later talked about all the vegetables that were grown locally, went to New York, and then trucks brought them back to his store. And we know that feeling a lot of times, don't we? But Trask Farms, and a lot of people were paid to work, prisoners of war. According to what I have read, Charles Swenson, do you know a little bit more? Have you ever done an article on that?
Prisoners of war, no, I don't think so. Although it seems like I remember somebody married one. Does that sound familiar?
Ooh, well, that's a story. Someone married a German prisoner of war. That's interesting. I'll have to do some homework. Yeah, that's interesting. That'd be worth a story. All right, good question though, and good statement that you remember. What else? Yes, sir.
Lee, thanks for your life work and sharing it with us today. It's fascinating, especially how you tied it in at the end to the future. And you know, keep it green and preserve Merle's Inlet. And our county council, the members that are here today, are working real hard on a plan for our future. What do you see as the most important things that the community needs to address to keep this the wonderful place it's been?
I think we talk a lot about the environment, and I think about having a place where people can voice concerns, but this idea of a community center, this idea of conversation with people. I gave Doc Lashcott a ride up to Waccamaw not too long ago, and he said, you know, people don't get together anymore like they used to. And I'm thinking, what do you mean? Because, you know, library, we have big events. But he spoke so eloquently about, we used to have church suppers. We used to have hymn sings. We used to all gather at the school. And people just don't do that anymore. Well, we do. But his perception and his memory of how they did it meant that it was intimate, that there were conversations. We come together a lot and have seminars and lectures and workshops, but maybe there's some sort of that human element. Obviously, I'm concerned about how do we maintain a human element if we dissolve the environment. But by the same token, that's something that I think is important. Creating space and places where we can continue to have conversations, because we do have a diversified population of black and white. Maybe we'll end up having a few more Asians. Native Americans may make themselves known to us. Men and women, north and south, maybe a few from the west. But I think not only a place to come together and learn, but also to have those conversations, to keep it on a human scale, whether it's development, massing of buildings and outdoor spaces. And because I like to think of myself as a people person, I think of that. But that's a deep thought question too. I'll be thinking about that all afternoon. Thank you for that thought-provoking question. Okay, hope that helps.
In the back, Will?
Thank you for that. I'm particularly interested as someone not from this area, as well as I'm sure a lot of us have family outside of this area. What are some of the common threads in the conversations that we can have in our communities that we would then be able to bring back to those other coastal communities, or other communities, to help continue this dialogue of how to improve our communities outside of the coastal area?
And just as a preface,
yeah, who is Will?
so you're in Will. Will is a sailor, a kayak sailor, who is, stand up, there he is. He just happens to be in the Georgetown vicinity this weekend, and we were put in touch with him through various sources, networking. He's going up the East Coast to draw attention to issues like climate change, environmental issues, and I think it was Amy less negative.
How do we hold people together? I think a lot of it gets back in my mind, and what I tried to include today, it's not all rice plantations and enslaved laborers. The stories are important, but it's not about the rich landowners. There are so many other stories, and there are a lot of stories that take place in the 20th century, more recent. I think we've spent a lot of time in America and in the South, I admit it, talking about plantations, and as tourism rose, we had to talk about the kinds of things that people wanted to hear. And thank goodness tourism, they want to hear broader stories. But I think not cutting off history at the end of the Civil War, which our history books in high school did, you know, the war ended and so did the South, boom. I think those stories are important, like we were talking about the decades and the changes. Because everybody comes from a different background. I think everybody has some sort of employment history in their family that's of value, whether it's coal mining, whether it is textile mills, whether it is agriculture. And then in the 20th century, independent business ownership. Again, that's back to that people and keep it human thing, but somehow a common thread about how individual lives were led. And over, you know, we talk about how the environment influences the culture and economics. Y'all remember some of y'all took that one economics course? Well, that changed my life, that one course. I would have taken more if I had time. But I think that the Waccamaw Neck has changed dramatically because of tourism and property ownership. And we've got a lot of displacement. And when we talk about not being able to hire people for restaurants and businesses, a lot of that has to do with that commute, and that's a universal theme. But to me, that is of interest to me if I were on a committee and continuing to study. I think those University of South Carolina students studying the steel mill really put that thought in my head, that there's a broader story involving employment, economics, displacement, and still preserving what we think is valuable. But who's doing the preservation? Who's doing the guiding? What socioeconomic class are they? What are we preserving? We preserve a lot of plantations and rice fields, and we're just starting to preserve some slave cabins, right? So it's interesting. What are we preserving? What are we caring for? How do we value things? And are all backgrounds, opinions of different people of different backgrounds being included? It's too much, too long, okay. That's another deep question. I'll be thinking about that this afternoon after my nap, because I'll be so worn out from the other question. Yeah. Good question.
And the rain dance.
And yeah, no more rain dancing. I just got to say this about the rain. What did we have? A little bit over 2 inches yesterday? What did you tell me?
Yeah, about 3 inches total over the last 2 days.
About 3. I happened to be driving home at about 6 o'clock last night, and Waverly Road was flooded. The shoulders were giving way, and all I could think of is this is one day, one rain, 24-hour period. We're going to look at a storm season and get a lot of rain. Our bridges, our roads, and our local roads. How many of y'all go to the recycling center at Pawleys Island? It's been a long time since they've been working on that road. I feel for the residents. I feel for those of us that might go once a week or more often. We're in store for some big surprises if we have a lot of rain or storms this year. It's been tough. And it's state money, it's federal money. It's not just all local, is it? So drive carefully. Stay in between the lines. Don't be running off the road on those shoulders. Help preserve the shoulders. But it's that little bit of rain just got me thinking. Standing water, your yard, stormwater runoff. Okay, get off my soapbox. Yes, sir. Yes.
I met you a long time ago, and I remember you telling me that we're the come-heres and you're the been-heres.
That is sort of that's an oft-repeated term now, the come-heres and been-heres. We had a North-South gathering at the old Waccamaw Library years ago where we had 3 people from the North versus 3 people from the South, and we had Barry McCall, our area magistrate, as the facilitator. And we had a real good conversation that day. The North-South gathering. Charles, is it time to do that again? Yes. Charles was past president I was the new president, and Linda Ketron and Charles and I talked a lot about that gathering. Charles wrote a good editorial following that about conversation, keeping that conversation going. I often like to end lectures too with the idea of, even though you may be from somewhere else, you live here now. You are a South Carolinian. You are a resident, I'm guessing, almost all of you, a resident of the Waccamaw Neck. And therefore, you have a vested interest, not just in the land and the water, but also in the people and the progress. And it's not always what you say, but it's how you say it. If you feel like been years, don't want to hear you, remember that old expression too. Well, back home, or where I came from, this is how we did it. You can still interject that, and that's valuable information. Why reinvent the wheel? But I've thought many times about my own friends who get so offended at advice and new information. And I think it's not always what you say, but it's how you say it. And you know that. You know that from business and from life. But I like to think that we're all here now. And Southerners and natives, we are a little bit different breed. We do get a little sensitive from time to time. But I think most of us just want to get along. Just want to get along. So thank y'all. Thank you.